Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the What Will AI Mean for the Future of Work panel. I'm Kevin Delaney. I'm the editor-in-chief and CEO of a company called Charter. We're a future of work media and research firm. You can learn more about us at charterworks.com. And we focus on flexible working, inclusion, and AI in work, all topics that we're going to work our way through today. Parenthetically, I would note that we're just launching on LinkedIn a campaign with the hashtag #ShePowersAI to try and highlight and work against the gender gap in terms of engagement with AI. Men, research is showing, are at this moment more engaged with a lot of the generative AI technologies, and it's important that women highlight their own use and their own role in that. So you can check that out on LinkedIn. So I recognize a few of you from the discussion yesterday we had about the future of the office. Thank you for coming back. And towards the end of that discussion yesterday, Tom Wilson, as some of you were there, saw, he's the CEO of Allstate. He sort of quietly said that he thought that generative AI would rip through the service sector and put a significant number of people out of work. He cited the example of his own industry, which is insurance, and how generative AI tools were actually just as good and in some ways better than humans in writing letters to the insurance clients or letters that they have to write between insurance carriers to resolve claims. So today we're going to pick up on that. We're going to discuss the impact of AI on the job market and the idea that it could both displace workers but also create new jobs and greater prosperity. And most important, we're looking to come away with a specific sense of what workers, employers, and educators need to prepare for this new AI era. So I'm excited to be here today with three excellent thinkers on this topic. And I'll start, Zoe, with you. As many of you know, Zoë Baird is a senior counselor for U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo for Technology and Economic Growth. She focuses on advancing U.S. competitiveness in key technologies and ensuring the economic benefits are shared by innovative businesses and a well-trained workforce. Previously, she was CEO and president of the Markle Foundation, which works to expand access to quality jobs for all Americans. Sitting next to her, Andy Bird, no relation, CEO of Pearson, the education publishing and assessment company, which you probably know. Pearson, they actually for about 2 decades have been at the forefront of using AI in applications spanning school, college to career. Andy, welcome. And then at the end, there's Joseph Briggs. He's a senior economist in global investment research at Goldman Sachs, where he co-leads the global economics research team. Joseph co-authored a widely read research report on the impact of generative AI in March, which you may have seen. We'll talk about in a minute. And previously, he was a senior economist at the Federal Reserve Board. Joseph, welcome. So we're going to talk for about 30 minutes among the three and try and work our way through some of these questions. And then we're going to open it up for you to ask questions of our amazing panelists in the time that we have. Joseph, I want to start with you. You put out this report in March, which was titled "The Potentially Large Effects of Artificial Intelligence on Economic Growth." And a big part of it was looking at what the implication is for jobs. Can you share the top takeaways and frameworks for people who may not have seen it?
Yeah, absolutely. Right off the top, one of the things that I would just reiterate, which you touched on, is that there's so much excitement around AI right now. And this applies definitely to the conversations we've heard here. But in my seat, in conversations with investors and corporates, there's been just a surge in interest over the last couple months. I mean, this is obvious, but what's really striking to me is that I haven't heard anyone take a counter view that AI is not going to be a big deal. Everyone seems fully bought into the idea that this is going to be a significant disruptor of the labor market. And it really reflects one of the obvious points that we conclude in our report, is that there's just a lot of things that workers do that generative AI models are very good at. We took a quantitative approach to making this point. We looked at task level data in the US and Europe and tried to estimate how much task exposure could potentially be automated by generative AI. We came up with a number of different estimates that have gotten headlines. 2/3 of workers in the US are exposed to some degree. If we put that on a full-time equivalent basis, about 25% of all work tasks could potentially be automated. If we extrapolate this globally, it means up to about 300 million jobs are potentially exposed to being automated by AI. These numbers are alarming, but we don't really think that you should interpret them as implying that 300 million jobs are going to go away in the next couple of years. That's not our view at all. We've estimated pretty large productivity boosts from the potential for AI automation, but the biggest driver of this is not necessarily worker displacement, but rather worker augmentation, where we think that generative AI is really going to free up a lot of time and a lot of capacity that allows workers to do things that are more productive and allows for a big boost to economic output.
So just to underscore what you just said, your analysis showed that 2/3 of work tasks, the tasks that people do, are potentially exposed to automation. Is that?
2/3 of occupation?
Of occupations.
25% of work tasks.
25% of work tasks. But what you're saying is that AI could be a complement to what workers are doing and isn't necessarily pushing them out of jobs.
Yeah, and the reason for this is if we look at the distribution of occupations and the distribution of exposures within occupations, what we find is that there's not a lot of occupations that are 50, 60, 70, 80% exposed. What we do find is that there's a lot of occupations that are 10, 20, 30, 40% exposed. And in these cases, we don't think that employers are necessarily, at least in the short run, going to find it beneficial to get rid of these jobs. Instead, we think that it'll lead to just more time to do more things. From my point of view, if I think about myself as a research analyst at Goldman Sachs, I spend a lot of day covering data releases, answering emails. These aren't necessarily the types of tasks that drive a lot of value that I bring to Goldman Sachs research. My value is that I do novel research, I answer interesting questions, and I think that these are less likely to be automated by generative AI. These type of tasks are less likely to be automated by generative AI in the near term. And so I think it's really going to free up a lot of capacity and stop us from having to do these somewhat repetitive tasks and let us do the things that we really bring to the table in terms of adding value to the economy.
I'm going to bring in Andy and Zoe in a second, but just one last point from your report. What you noted was that historically the introduction of new technology has resulted in a net increase in employment over the long term. But there's this word that people use, it's displacement or dislocation, and it's often discussed as something that could happen in the short term, which is, and what that means, I think, very literally, is that people are pushed out of their jobs because companies find that they can do them more cheaply or efficiently by AI. What is your assessment? That's your long-term view is that there will be a net increase, but in the short term, how would you talk about the risk of dislocation, displacement, and so forth?
So most of our work has focused on the long-run impact, and the evidence there is pretty clear that if we look back over the last 80 years, only 40% of workers today are employed in positions that existed in 1940. And so put differently, this means that 85% of job growth over the last 80 years has been driven by technology change. And so we shouldn't be scared of technology change's impact in the long run. Maybe this time could be different. I'm a bit skeptical given the long historical record. I do think that there is some more potential for short-term disruptions. In the 90s and 2000s, we saw a dynamic where the rate of labor displacement initially outpaced the rate at which new jobs were created by technology. I think there's some risk of that now, and it is why it's important to have appropriate policies in place to manage this transition.
Okay, and we'll come back to some of those policies. I'm going to pull Andy and Zoe in. Andy, there's a lot in there. Can you share your assessment of the impact of AI on the jobs landscape broadly?
Sure. I think firstly, it's important to ground ourselves. AI in of itself isn't new, as was mentioned in the introduction. We all use AI in our everyday tasks and applications at work and at home. Anyone with a smartphone and an app on it, it has probably been driven by some form of AI. What's excited everyone, of course, is generative AI. And that is what is creating a lot of the discussion. And it's on the one hand, I would describe it, it's a bit like a brattish teenager. It thinks it's right 100% of the time, even when it's wrong. And one of the interesting aspects of generative AI, and we're at really early stages here, is the difficulty in training these large language models and the confidence that it displays in the answers, the output that it gives. And so, picking up on Joseph's point, it is very, very good at certain tasks. It is awful at other tasks. So, as an illustration, maybe, we are the largest college publisher in US colleges. And we have if any are interested in biology, we have a Campbell's Biology as the gold standard of biology education in US colleges. And so we've been feeding various large language models questions from Campbell's Biology. And we put it into 3 different large language models, and all of them very confidently came up with the same answer, and the same answer was the wrong answer. So when you start to apply, if you think about what it's good at, summarizing, doing a lot of these tasks that Joseph was referencing, it's really great. It hasn't experienced life, is probably the easiest way to think about it, and all the machinations that come there. And then maybe one other thought, which is, I'm a massive fan, by the way. I think that this, like smartphones, if we go back in time, it's often instructive as to how the future beholds. Before the advent of the iPhone and touch screens, and we had buttons and everything like that, there was a whole economy that didn't exist, which was the App Store economy. There was no Uber. There couldn't be an Uber without the smartphone technology and the AI that then drove it. So to Joseph's point, I'm a huge fan of that. And then one final point is on the displacement notion, which I think is a serious notion, but again, I remain optimistic. It's a timing issue. We saw this change in workforce happening before COVID. This was something that technology was driving. I think COVID in many ways acted as an accelerant, and then you layer on generative AI on top of that in certain disciplines, and it becomes a massive disruptor. But there is silver lining in all of this. If you think of the analog world, in financial services, if I was an accountant, well, that is probably something that generative AI is going to be very, very good at. In the old world, an accountancy firm would make all of the accountants redundant. Now, did you know the average accountant holds 75% of the skills needed to become a data scientist? So you can flip generative AI to understand the skills of an individual and the skills needs of an organization, and then retrain and upskill and reskill the population. That maintains productivity, it has greater efficiency, and certainly as Pearson, we're spending a lot of time working with companies doing just that. Particularly in many of the fields that Joseph mentioned. And so I'm very much, there's a bit of a beware of the bratish teenager syndrome, but very much on the glass is very much half full rather than half empty.
Okay, great. Zoë, can I ask you for your high-level assessment of the impact of AI on the jobs landscape?
Well, let me play off of what was just said. I think it's really interesting to contemplate how much change there's been from technologies over time in really every sector. And what is driving the change now is a whole range of technologies. So we're making major investments as a country to be competitive in the technology fields that are going to drive our both economic and national security interests for the long term, but also in other fields that are impacted by technology. There's almost no area of enterprise that isn't impacted by technology. We were at another panel that a number of you were at, and someone was talking about construction workers using an iPad on the job site. There's really enormous change in what the skills are that are required for almost any kind of job in any sector. So what we really need to be thinking about with that, and what we're, very much trying to focus on as an administration, is the Biden administration's emphasizing investments in areas like broadband build-out so that people have high-speed internet around the country, in semiconductors so that we can make the chips that drive AI and we can be competitive, and we can lead in that globally, in the supply chains that feed construction and everything else, where we're, as a country, investing in our competitiveness. In all these areas, we need workforce investments in order to enable people to use the skills they have in these adjacent fields. As you were just saying, I think that point about adjacencies that you made is one of the most important points, that we have thought historically that if you work in the auto industry, you work in the auto industry. If you work in the semiconductor industry, you work in the semiconductor industry. But in fact, if we're really going to rapidly enable people to succeed in the jobs that are developing and will develop in the future, we need to break that down more granularly and understand that you have 75% of the skills, if you're an accountant, to, or whatever the number was you said, to move over into being a data scientist, and that we are desperate for data scientists. And I think this is really going to be the heart of the opportunity for Americans and really people all over the world to participate in the economy as it grows and as it is changed, because we will be able to have people. Someone in the audience is from a community college in Florida, was talking to me about micro-credentials, where they're able to add small, rapid, affordable training to things people have already done. And you might want to comment during the Q&A session, but to things people have already done in order to enable them to get into those new jobs. So instead of, thinking about this as one particular technology, we really need to look at it in terms of how do we create a system of adult training and constant learning so that people can constantly be moving into great opportunities and be respected for the talents that they have as the world is changing, regardless of which technology it is.
Andy? Yep.
I just wanted to pick up, that's such an excellent point. If we all go back, many of us are, we're moving to a skills-based, certification-based economy. What was the one certificate that mattered historically? The degree certificate. That was your gateway to better employment, and for you as an individual, better, and for the economy as a whole, better economic prospects. We're seeing, and this is what I referenced, I think, starting before COVID and has been accelerating, that in of itself, I think degrees are very, very important, but that in of itself is no longer enough. And I think you're going to see, and this maybe leads back as you reverse from careers back into education, the needs for education. For when you go to college, you have a core of academic certification supplemented by a series of certifications that are skills-based. Mm-hmm. AI in marketing, whatever it happens to be. So when you enter to the workforce, as you started a career, it's look at me. It's not that I have a degree in English language and literature, but I also then have certifications in this. That is the way to think about some of these opportunities.
So you're talking about the shift to a skills-based employment and training and so forth. And Joseph, you, when you're doing this analysis, you looked at a kind of skill and task level. Can you talk about, as we're looking ahead and trying to figure out how we and our children will all be employed years from now, what are the skills that stand out as the most easily replaced by generative AI? And the skills, if you're advising any of us here, the skills that feel like they have the most resistance to it and would be good ones if someone wanted to invest in their own future career.
So in terms of the skills that can be most easily replaced, I think that anyone that has played around with these models can see that they're very good at generating content, they're very good at summarizing information, they're very good at preparing a draft of a report or image based on some criteria that you put in. And so anything along these lines, AI models are very good at, and they're only going to get better at. And so I think that these skills are the types, or these tasks are the types that are most likely to be replaced. A big question that's outstanding is whether or not generative AI models are going to materially speed up the adoption of robotics. We were somewhat skeptical in our analysis that this were to be the case. I know that there's differing views around this. The reason that we didn't account for the adoption or the pickup in adoption of robotics due to generative AI is because people have been talking about self-driving cars for a long period of time. The translation from the content space to the physical space, I think, is a big step that generative AI models could help us get there eventually, but probably not in the near term. If you do allow for the possibility that generative AI speeds up the automation of physical tasks, then the impact on the labor market could be much bigger than what we've estimated.
One of the striking things is McKinsey just had a report out last week, and they showed the impact on employment by education level before generative AI and after generative AI. And what was striking is that the people at the highest levels of education, PhDs, masters, advanced education, all saw some of the greatest impact. And this seems to be kind of a new development. We've been thinking about automation as something that replaces and endangers our lowest skilled workers, but what we're talking about here is, like, God forbid, technology that endangers the employment of our PhDs. So, Joseph, that feels like a big shift. I'd be interested if you looked at that and have any perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely consistent with our findings. If you look at the type of occupations and industries that scored highly as being prone to automation, it was office and executive support, legal, engineering, actually, because AI models are very good at coding. These are industries that are typically more skewed to the upper middle class than the jobs that were automated in the 90s and 2000s. And so the broad pattern is entirely consistent with our analysis. Again, though, I'm somewhat skeptical that you're going to see the lawyers and the PhDs in science find their jobs be automated away. Just because if you think about the capacity that's going to be freed up, it's not necessarily the tasks that drive a lot of value in their work. A PhD engineer researcher doesn't get paid and doesn't drive a lot of economic value in his ability to answer a bunch of emails. He gets paid and drives a lot of economic value based on the more creative work that he does. And so I do think that it's worth bearing in mind the difference between exposure and what can actually be used to just engage in more productive activities.
Yep, that's a good point. Andy?
I was just going to pick up, many of you may have read about a month or so ago, the lawyer who was sent down because he'd used ChatGPT to create a case precedent that was totally fictitious. And the judge found out. So that's where I think picking up, the trust is going to become so important.
Yeah.
I think there is, another way of maybe thinking about generative AI is it's really good at black and white, on and off, binary. So coding is fantastic, content creation, things like that. What do we as humans excel in? We excel in the gray. That gray is creativity, that gray is your gut feeling, that gray actually comes out of your experience of life. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're going to have to modify, just as when the app stores came along. Look at all the job creation there's been as a result of the App Store and Google Play and that technology. There's always going to be a human element that plays, and I think that's what's important. And it's worth remembering also The US, we are literally world leaders with this technology.
Yeah.
And that's something that we should be very proud of.
Come to Zoe on that in a sec, but just what you said, you've talked about the gray and the human element, and when we're talking to our children who are looking out into the future of their careers, or where, there are all sorts of research that suggests that all of us will need to reskill and retrain ourselves for the changes that are here and are coming. The one thing that you hear is, oh, liberal arts degrees are good because it's a human thing, and robots, are not don't excel in those fields. Do you have any specific advice, Andy, for people to translate what you just said into, advice for the 20-year-old who's trying to think about how to remain employable?
I have a 26 and 28-year-old.
Okay, what are you telling them?
So I'm telling them, be curious. I think the first thing you can do is try to understand as much about this technology as you can yourself.
Yeah.
So you may not become expert. It is amazing with Gen Z. Do you know the average attention span of Gen Z? It's 2.3 seconds. These guys know how to multitask like no one else before us. So what looks very alien, because we grew up in a linear world of we do this, stop it, and then start something else. I take my son's phones, and they've got, 20 things going on at the time. They are used to chaos in a way that certainly my generation, myself, I can't comprehend. I do think there is a fundamental and very, very important role for education in this, starting at K through 12 into how you redefine what higher education is in this context of being part institutional, part enterprise, part of academic, part about life skills. I think that is, if I gave advice, is about live life and experience life and allow generative AI and technology to supplement and ease many of those tasks that can be done, and done very, very effectively. They can, one of the things that generative AI is really good is sort of writing headlines or marketing headlines and campaigns. You still, I think, need human intervention to kind of look at, well, no, we should do that one, or that one doesn't quite. There's something about us in our DNA, which is through lifelong experience, that I think is going to remain very important.
So we're talking about different categories of institutional response to this change. So there's automation, which is you replace the human with the generative AI tool. There's augmentation, where you give them, the PhD, a tool that allows them to get through their emails faster. And then there's the reskilling, dimension of this, where you help the accountant become a data scientist so that they have a continuous career. Do you think it's reasonable for us to expect companies to skew towards the augmentation and the reskilling? In other words, when we're thinking about the potential dislocation of jobs and workers, our children, our friends, our neighbors losing their jobs because of this technology, can we expect companies, based on your experience both in the government but over years working on workforce development, can we expect companies to take that other road, which is to retrain their employees and say, this is a tool, this is not a cost savings we're going to report next quarter?
I'll jump into that in 1 second.
Yeah.
But before I do that, I want to say to the Bezos scholars in the room, or who may tune in later when they're multitasking and not spending all their time sitting and listening to a panel, but have got 4 going, that this is not the end of good jobs and an education needed in technology. We need massive numbers of engineers in semiconductors. So if you are looking at, tech companies laying off workers who majored in computer science, and you didn't think of taking that semiconductor course, think about it, because we have enormous needs for talented, trained people in a whole range of technologies. But we've had a pretty singular view of what technology training is. Walter Isaacson's here. He can tell you about biotech, he can tell you about genetics, he can tell you about the whole extraordinary fields of technology training, and maybe he'll comment on that during the Q&A session. But we tend to get so singularly focused, we're all in on one thing, and we forget that there are gains to be made in so many arenas for such great public benefit and great economic growth and competitiveness. So to get back to your question, I think business, large and small, is very much recognizing that their perhaps number one challenge is finding the skilled workforce that they need. And I think most business leaders would, and certainly as I've talked around here, people have said this, that they are not expecting that generative AI is going to replace that enormous need they have for trained workers and for talented workers. And they really need to be, and I think increasingly are recognizing that business has a role in training its workers. It's something we used to do as a country very effectively. Some other countries do it better than we do. But the challenges we're talking about are challenges of keeping workers able to be effective and provide both satisfying and high-value roles as the world is changing around us. Someone in an earlier panel today commented on, whether we're going to have enough workers in the future just because of demographics. I mean, there's all kinds of forces at play. Instead of trying to speculate on, which force is going to be more important, there's a lot of work to be done to take advantage of the opportunities we have, to take that kid who loves, virtual reality at home and get them out using the virtual reality headset on a construction site or an oil field where the jobs look like the things you love to do. You just don't realize you can monetize those things you love to do. So that's really where I think business will put a lot of effort, and certainly as the government is investing with companies, we're certainly encouraging them to be really doubling down on their role in training workers.
Yeah, and there are ways in which policy can support it. Also, tax incentives, for example, for training as opposed to just capital investment in humans and that sort of thing. We're going to go in a few minutes to questions. Joseph, I wanted to go back to you in terms of the generative AI in the workplace. In response to some of the stories like the one that Andy mentioned about the lawyer writing a ridiculous brief, or the incident at Samsung where they fed their confidential information into ChatGPT only for it to be available to the rest of the world. A lot of the reaction of a lot of workplaces has been, keep this tool out of our workplace. And yet, do you have any reaction to that and the role of broad deployment of it in success of businesses and actually using these tools?
I think that broad deployment will come. I don't necessarily think it's going to come in the next year or two. I've actually been a little bit more bearish than many of the people that I talk to on the prospects of seeing huge labor market impacts in the next couple of years. I think that we're several years away from seeing it show up in any sort of the productivity or labor statistics. The reason being is that companies have to sort through how they want to manage privacy concerns, how they want to manage regulation concerns, and furthermore, just figure out how they want to deploy it in their businesses. That being said, one thing where I think that worker and company interests are very well aligned is that AI is going to be a tool that can make workers more productive. That's good for companies, and so to the extent that companies can go ahead and start allowing workers to experiment with it, and they can start training their workers on how they can leverage generative AI to increase output, this will help dampen the impact of displacement. It'll allow for companies to increase revenue, and it'll allow for workers to develop skills that make them better equipped to contribute to the economy in their current company or in another company in the future. And so I think that training by companies of their employees to use generative AI is a big thing that could lead to a significantly more positive outcome.
Andy, you're a CEO of a big company. What is your current approach to that?
embrace it, learn as much as you can, and we use a lot of the tools. Joseph mentioned we use it a lot in tech engineering, coding. We use it in content production. We use it embedded within some of our businesses. You're going to see it embedded very soon within some of our educational product as well, because we think that there are more benefits to it. But at the same time, we are very wary in terms of we have policy, company policy around what you can and can't do in terms of how you utilize some of these tools. I think it is very important, and maybe Zoe has some thoughts around legislation around this. It's going to be super, super important. There was maybe a missed opportunity with social media and the internet platforms. These are going to become very, very powerful tools, and you know, back to the British teenager of it, and you know, other examples, the Drake Weekend song that was completely generated by AI. It brings in a lot of questions around intellectual property and remuneration. For us, we employ over 5,000 authors. And we presume that these large language models have ingested all of our content. In fact, they've ingested all of your content, including a lot of your own personal content, which society hasn't quite yet woken up to. The EU is actually leading a lot in that regard around legislation in that space. I know the US, you know, recently President Biden met with the UK Prime Minister and around this very subject. And I think, you know, the area of legislation shouldn't get in the way, but is something that, as a CEO, I'm very wary of in terms of how we deploy. But I see it very much as a productivity tool and efficiency.
We're going to take questions now. We have microphones around the room, so if you raise your hand, I'd ask if you say your name first, and if you keep your questions sort of brief. Maybe we'll start right here, and then we'll work our way up the front.
Hi, my name is Kathy, and I work and live in El Paso, Texas. I'm here as a Hunt Aspen Fellow. And my question is, so in light of the augmentative potential of AI for workers, I've noticed that there's a very careful sort of wording that the increase is always talked about in terms of productivity and not efficiency. And I think it's interesting, and I'm very interested to get your perspective on the view that, you know, how can we leverage AI in the context of future of work to create a better work-life balance, to perhaps think about a shorter work day or work week, and to also help with, you know, the mental health and physical health crisis of working moms who are trying to balance, you know, a lot. So.
Andy, do you want to?
Yes, it's a wonderful question, and actually I do use the word efficiency. I think it drives efficiencies. As a company, we don't have a work from home or work from office mandate. We trust you as an employee to do what you want to do, and very much focus. A large proportion of our employee is female, but it goes beyond that in terms of just the work-life balance. We see it also through different demographics. And so I think being able to utilize this tool to be more efficient, I expect the people who work for Pearson to produce high-quality, trusted products. I don't care if that takes you 1 hour or 12 hours, 1 day, 2 weeks. You are the arbiter in that. And I think this flexibility I referenced to my own children, I see they don't want to be dictated to in terms of you must do this, the old traditional Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. I think they're moving in a much more fluid work environment. And I think that's actually very good, and particularly as it relates to mental health. I see a lot of that within our own workforce, the mental health stresses.
Great. Over here, actually. And Walter, you've been outed. Can we put you on the spot for a reaction in a minute?
Hi,
okay, go ahead.
Michael Bryan. I'm at Drexel University, London Institute for Urban Innovation. I had a question about wages. particularly given what we saw happening pre-COVID with some of the threats around jobs, et cetera, with the sort of like push in capitalism at large for cheaper labor kind of constantly. I'm curious, what are your thoughts around the issues of wage stagnation, wage suppression, I mean, all the language that we're using to kind of figure that out, particularly with issues around parity when you're dealing with the skills based initiatives that are coming in. So like in tech, you can come in at a certain skill level, it's comparable, but your pay is not comparable. And as you're even increasing in pay, there's still no parity. So just curious your thoughts about wage suppression.
Do you want to
wages,
start,
et cetera.
Joseph, and Zoe? I don't.
Yeah. So I think the effect on wages is largely going to depend on ultimately how much displacement we see. And the reason I say that is if we think from just economic fundamentals, what's the main driver of wage growth? It's productivity gains and then competition for labor. If we're right and people are able to take a lot of freed up time to engage in more productive activities, now companies will realize some of that, but it will also be positive for wages because individual productivity is going up. I think where you would be more concerned about downward pressure on wages is if you were to see significant displacement, and so a lot of people losing their jobs due to generative AI. That's not our base case, but and I've outlined several reasons why we're skeptical that you're going to see as much displacement as many people fear. But that would be the main reason why I would think it would be negative for wage growth. Overall, I would take a fairly positive view.
Do you have anything to add, Zoe?
That's okay.
Walter, I just sort of, Zoe spotted you back there. We want to see if you have any reaction.
Problem of getting here in the back. Yeah, there are a few thoughts, and I'll pick up on what Joseph said, which is never in history has technology, which almost by definition is an increase in productivity of human labor, ever reduced the total amount of jobs. It simply disrupted jobs and changed the nature of work. So we can assume that this is a technology that will increase productivity enormously. Then there should be more demand for new types of work. So we have to ask, who will benefit what types of new jobs instead of worrying about people being put out of work? And the one thought I had, which is more of a question because I'm still trying to germinate it, is as I look at GPT-4, at Bard, and some of the others, and I've had a glimpse at GPT-5 now, everything from its hallucinations to its mistakes are rooted in the data set upon which it was trained. And so what content creators do is we create data sets. I look at the huge data sets that exist now and that are being created. Pearson obviously is one, but even Elon Musk has Twitter, and when he bought it, there's 1 billion tweets a day, which is a hive mind mentality. He cuts off the API so that he could license that to generative large language model intelligence, AI, so that it could be used. So I'm looking at who will have the great data sets of good content that's reliable, so it's not the lawyer making up footnotes that Zoe or I can't remember Kevin mentioned. And I think those will be some of the winners, is if you've got really high quality, really good, really timely data, whether you're NBC News or the New York Times or maybe Twitter, and also real-world data, not just language model data, such as cameras from cars or cameras from security on the streets. All of that is a data set that will help train reliable AI in the future.
Do you want to take that, Andy?
Very quickly, and then I don't know if you have something coming. I was just going to say, I couldn't agree, you would expect me to say this, but Walter, I couldn't agree more. And actually, I referenced some of the work we're doing with Campbell's biology, and we're finding it's about quality of data in increases quality of data out. And so if you think about, you create like a sandbox that lives on top of the large language models, we're finding the quality of the data out versus just the general LLMs when we feed just Campbell's, for example, into the model is about 100% better in terms of the probability of not hallucinating and these other things. It's less brattish, let's say. And so I think that's going to continually improve.
One thing that the computer scientists working on this that I've talked to have said is that these tools are just very early stages, and they'll get better at fact-checking themselves as well. There's not a sort of fact-checking cycle in them, but that seems like a straightforward computer science problem for them.
Even local journalism could benefit from this.
Yeah.
Because that would have high quality, if you're the local newspaper and you fact check, that would be a high quality data. So it may help local journalism.
Amen. Walter, for those of you who couldn't hear, was saying it may help local journalism in that regard. We have time for a few more questions. I don't know where the microphones are. They're back, maybe in the back there, and then we'll come down here. Sorry.
Thank you. That was a great panel, and you came up with some wonderful terminology and aspects. But in the issue of training versus education, any of us who have children, even over the age of 5, much less grandchildren, are very, very concerned of how they are already using generative AI and how they're already, chat whatever, 6, 7, 8 will be here within a wink of an eye. Oh, and by the way, I'm with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Cyber Century Forum. I guess I'm going to pick on Mr. Baird because you have education in your mission. Do you or does anyone doing anything to help not offset, and it's not augment, but not destroy learning, independent learning, critical thinking, creativity and ingenuity of the individual? And we have kids who, we've been through our kids learning to write like Unabombers and, all these kinds of things. But is there anything that you know of that is working with school systems that are all effective, or children's programs, to try and help blend the benefits, but also teach the challenges and liabilities?
Yes, it's called Pearson. And I don't mean that flippantly. We take this very, very seriously. One of the good things that, in inverted commas, that you can do and have read about with ChatGPT and others is just cut straight to the answer. That benefits nobody. And we are we're the world's largest learning company, and we take that mission and the obligation very, very seriously, which is why I said you will see us coming out very soon with a number of products that has generative AI embedded into the learning process itself, because that fundamentally, critical thinking, both for also the other side of this, it's not just the students, it's the faculty. So we're engaged a lot with faculty as well as with students. Super important. If you sort of reverse engineer all this back, how the country approaches education going forward, and some of maybe even the legislation in that world, is going to be super, super critical.
Time for one more question, I think, on this side. Do we have someone? No? Okay. Where can we get a microphone? Right there, actually. Sorry.
Okay, this is probably a little lower level and a little bit selfish. I attended the Writers Guild of America strike last week, and among other things, residuals and things, one of the pains is that what seems to be happening is the studios are cutting costs by hiring one head writer and getting rid of all the others, because they say, look, all the stuff that's on CBS, ABC, that's all formulaic. You can follow it, and it can be written by AI all the time. And so since all your suggestions involve left brain training, everything, 25% of the skills or 75% of the skills of an accountant could now go to data. What about these people who have Yale graduates, they're Yale graduates and they're writers for television and they're losing jobs? Where can they go? What type of thing would they retrain?
Joseph, do you have
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a great question, and in any sort of technology change, there is going to be, or period of technology change, there will be some displacement where some skills are made, less valuable than they were before. What I would say is, in thinking about the skill set, say for writers, that could be portable to the other parts of the economy. The critical thinking aspect, is one that I think that generative AI is not necessarily good at. In terms of cranking out routine text, AI is going to be good at that, and if that's the value that you're bringing, then it's going to be hard to compete with AI just because it can do things so much quicker. And so I would really focus on thinking about, what are the things that generative AI models can't do, and the way that I would approach that would be thinking about what sort of disparate information can I connect, what are things that I can write about that haven't been covered in the past that AI is not going to be good at summarizing. But it is admittedly a tough question, and despite the fact that I think that the overall productivity gains are going to be pretty positive in the long term, there is obviously a risk of short-term displacement that creates some tough questions that are hard to answer.
10 seconds, because I know we've run out of time. I spent 15 years at the Walt Disney Company, and 2 words: human creativity. So any of you who go to any Disney theme park and experience the attractions, that's the Imagineers that create those. Or anyone who goes to see a Pixar or a Disney or a Marvel, it's human creativity. And human creativity is drawn out of human experience. And machines don't have that.
Thank you for that. And there's some really important takeaways, I think, from here. Zoe, among other things, you pointed out that the country needs skilled tech workers, and there's an opportunity to look at areas like semiconductors. Andy, that example of the reskilling of the accountant, I think, is a powerful one, and probably a template for how some companies can be proactive in thinking about skilling their workplaces. And Joseph, it is reassuring that your base case is for higher wages and for more jobs. So we'll end on that positive note. Thank you. Thanks to the 3 of you, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you.